ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. My name is Detlef Gericke Schönhagen. I'm the director of the Goethe-Institut Boston. I want to welcome you to tonight's program, which is organized by the German Consul General, Mr. Schütte, and his team. Remembering the two dictatorships is a crucial question and a permanent challenge in our work. Thanks to my colleague Susanne Klingenstein and to my team in the Goethe-Institut, I think we had and we will have some interesting programs dealing with the first dictatorship. To deal with the GDR, the fall of the wall, and the wonderful peaceful revolution of 1989 depends on three things: outstanding literature, outstanding film productions, and outstanding good ideas by educators. I'm therefore very thankful that Mr. Axel Klausmeier will give us new aspects and new ideas tonight. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Tonight I would not like to extend a warm welcome to you, but a cool welcome to you. I think that's more appropriate with the weather change. My name is Rolf Schütte and I'm the German Consul General here in the 6 New England states. Ladies and gentlemen, last weekend people in this country celebrated Memorial Day. Thus it seems very appropriate to choose this week for an event which is devoted to the topics memory, remembrance and memorials. Our speaker tonight, Professor Dr. Axel Klausmeier, is one of Germany's leading experts in this field. And that is quite an accomplishment in a country where remembrance plays a particularly important role in the political, social and moral public discourse. In his famous, and you may truly call it historical speech in the German Bundestag on the 8th of May 1985, during the ceremony commemorating the 40th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe and of National Socialist tyranny, former German President Richard von Weizsäcker quoted the Jewish adage, and I quote him, "Seeking to forget makes exile all the longer. The secret of redemption lies in remembrance." End of quote. These words were quoted in the context of how Germany and Germans today can deal with their country's shameful past during the Nazi years, and in particular regarding the Holocaust, and what has led up to this deepest abyss of Germany's history. President Weizsäcker, in another part of this speech, also said, and I quote him again, "Remembering means recalling an occurrence honestly and undistortedly, so that it becomes a part of our very beings. This places high demands on our truthfulness." End of quote. These demands are probably relevant for people everywhere, as there is no country which can look back at its history and see only bright and glorious events. At least not when this looking back is, as Weizsäcker said, honest and undistorted. However, having lived as a diplomat in several countries and reflecting on the history of my own country, I personally observed that there are quite some differences in how countries deal with the not so bright chapters of their history, both officially and as people. This seems to be partially due to the question of whether people collectively or individually view the history of their country as what I would call broken or unbroken. This is not the place for me to reflect on my observations in this context, having spent many years in countries like Russia, Israel, Italy or the United States, all of them with a most fascinating history. But when talking about Germany, I see the classical case of a broken history, a history with so many and such dramatically dark chapters that looking back and remembering is a most challenging and often also most painful endeavor. Vergangenheitsbewältigung is the German word for this process. The dictionary translates this long German word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, with an equally clumsy, I quote, process of coming to terms with the past. I would also say the attempt of trying to come to terms with Germany's broken history. And there's certainly no other place in Germany where this attempt is so topical as it is in Berlin. When I first met our speaker, Professor Dr. Klausmeier, it was during my years as Chief of Protocol of Berlin. We then prepared the festivities commemorating a very happy event, the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But we invited Professor Klaus Meyer to come to Boston to participate in a roundtable at the JFK Museum devoted to the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's famous speech in Berlin, where the American president famously exclaimed, "Ich bin ein Berliner." In the other direction, we invited the director of the JFK Museum, Tom Putnam, to participate in the respective events which will take place at the end of June in Berlin, and I'm very happy that Dr. Putnam is here with us tonight. But Herr Klausmeier is responsible not only for these joyful events. Born in 1965 in Essen, a student of art history, medieval and modern history in Bochum, München and Berlin, with a rich background working in historical institutions, and now as director of the Berlin Wall Foundation since 2009, and professor for historic, cultural and memorial landscapes at the University of Cottbus, and as author of numerous publications on the documentation, handling and discussion of historical structures and historical cultural landscapes, we could not have found a better expert to talk about the special challenges of dealing with Germany's broken history, in particular its two dictatorships, not only from a Berlin perspective. So I welcome Professor Klausmeier, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Können wir die Gesamtansicht machen? Dear Herr Gericke Schönhagen, Consul Schütte, ladies and gentlemen, I would first of all like to express my deepest gratitude to both the German Consul General to the New England States, Rolf Schütte, and the director of the Boston Goethe-Institut, Herr Gericke Schönhagen, for inviting and giving me the opportunity to speak here tonight. It's a great honor and privilege to speak to you, my distinguished audience. Herr Schütte, thank you very much for your kind and very thoughtful introduction and the welcoming words. And thank you all for coming tonight in this weather, and thank you very much for your interest in this difficult and, for some of you, I'm sure, certainly also painful topic. From my point of view, remembering the two German dictatorships begins with a fateful date shared by both. No date in modern German history is more unique and significant than November 9th. The 9th of November brings together at least two political extremes. From the terrible pogrom of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, in 1938 to the joy of the fall of the wall in 1989. Furthermore, in the German historical calendar, November 9th appears more than twice as a significant date. In an historic speech held on the balcony of the Reichstag in Berlin on November 9th, 1918, for example, Philipp Scheidemann, social democratic politician and later Chancellor of the Weimar Republic, proclaimed an end to the monarchy of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the beginning of a new democracy. But the young democracy in Germany had a very difficult beginning. Both left and right-wing extremists wanted it eliminated immediately. On November 9th, 1923, the Nazi Party led by Adolf Hitler marched into Munich's Feldherrnhalle. Hitler would take power 10 years later and bring about one of the world's greatest catastrophes ever, World War II and the annihilation of the Jews. The disenfranchisement of Jews in Germany, however, began long before the Nazis embarked on their plan to systematically murder European Jewry in 1942. Before World War II started on November 9th, 1938, as I had already mentioned, synagogues across the German Reich were torched. Jewish-owned businesses were plundered, and at least 100 Jews were murdered that night. 26,000 were deported to concentration camps. This pogrom served as an early test for the Holocaust. In the list of fateful events that occurred on November 9th, that day in 1938 is no doubt the most terrible. It stands out in great contrast to November 9th, 1989, the day the Berlin Wall fell. Madness was the word most often heard that night when East Germany unexpectedly opened its borders to the West. For months, citizens had been protesting against the governing Politburo of the East German Communist Party, SED. Thousands of East German citizens had already fled through Hungary and into West German embassies in Eastern European countries. The pressure to ease travel restrictions for all East German citizens grew by the day. And yet, no one saw it coming after the new travel regulations were announced at an international press conference in East Berlin and declared to be effective immediately. There was no turning back. People stormed the inner city border crossings in divided Berlin. The jubilation was, in the truest sense and meaning of the term, borderless. The first hole in the Berlin Wall brought the faltering system to a quick end. For the fourth time, November 9th went down in history, but this time in absolute joy. The opening of the Berlin Wall in 1989 became the key date of German reunification. However, for at least 136 people who died at the border, the wall came down too late. People who wanted no more than to leave their country were ostracized, imprisoned, injured, or killed. Such violations of human rights were part of a political system that could not exist without a wall. It collapsed when the wall fell. So this talk will, in a brief overview, concentrate on how Germany in general and Berlin in particular deals with its complicated past, how victims are commemorated, and how methods and experiences of coming to terms with the Nazi atrocities help promote a comprehensive reappraisal of the dictatorship in communist East Germany. And finally, I would like to illustrate the decentralized concept for establishing memorials at authentic sites in Germany by presenting a few examples of sites from both dictatorships. I realize that achieving this in only 45 minutes is a rather big challenge. Memorial sites, and now I start with the first dictatorship and commemoration sites of Nazi terror. Memorial sites serve as the key manifestation of government-supported commemoration of the two 20th century German dictatorships. Most of the memorials addressing the Nazi period were established relatively late in the old Federal Republic. They came about as a consequence of the student movement's confrontation with the Nazi past that began in the late 1960s, along with the dedicated involvement of private citizens in the mid-70s. Over time, a diverse, decentralized memorial landscape developed. Since the 80s, memorials at the local level have increasingly been engaged in a reappraisal of National Socialist crimes and creating civic education programs. Germany now has thousands of memorials dedicated to remembering the victims of the Holocaust. These sites provide school children and wide groups of people a chance to learn about the massive assault on European Jewry at authentic sites. Other than in the Federal Republic of West Germany, in former communist East Germany in the late 1950s, national memorials were established at the former concentration camps of Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück. The presentation of these historic sites was strongly influenced by the communist ideology and state-ordained anti-fascism. The communist leadership in East Germany often misused the commemoration of victims to legitimize its own rule. Nowhere did these sites, for example, acknowledge the suffering of victims held in the Soviet special camps from 1945 to 1950. For this reason, after German unification in October 1990, there was an urgent need to redesign these memorials into a form that would reflect the current state of research. Permanent funding is, of course, an important constant in the operation of memorials. In the Federal Republic, cultural sovereignty lies first and foremost with the federal states. Prior to 1990, the establishment and maintenance of memorials addressing the National Socialist dictatorship, with a few exceptions, were the responsibility of the states, not the federal government. Hence, federal funding of memorials is a direct consequence of German unification. The new memorial sites, and I'm showing you the example of the Sachsenhausen Memorial Site north of Berlin. These new memorial sites see themselves as educational sites based on scientifically sound research. Unlike traditional historical museums, these memorial sites are monuments of their time. They are both crime sites and places of suffering, both real and symbolic grave sites and cemeteries. From the early 90s, the emerge of memorial sites as the key manifestation of commemorative culture to remember both dictatorships was only possible through the ongoing funding provided by the federal government. In 1995, the 13th German Bundestag appointed a commission of experts to develop a memorial concept and to assess the national significance of the memorials. All of Germany was affected by the Nazi dictatorship. Hence, the commemoration sites are dispersed throughout the entire country. But the memorials addressing the communist dictatorship are limited to the territory of former East Germany. The Commission also acknowledged the central historic role of Berlin, where both dictatorships had their seats of power. This also explains why there is such a large concentration of memorials in contemporary history museums in Berlin. A central challenge is and was positioning the two dictatorships historically. It was important that in comparison of the two dictatorships, neither relativize the crimes of National Socialists nor trivialize those of the SED Communist Party. This phrase played an important role in the establishment of a federal memorial concept for both dictatorships. The German Bundestag passed this memorial concept in 2008, and it became the conceptual foundation for the federal funding of memorial sites bearing national significance. In this way, it succeeded in establishing negative memory in the Federal Republic as a federally funded public responsibility and as a resource for democratic culture that is substantiated by educational learning. The concept also states, and I quote, "Each generation has to be taught anew the lessons from these chapters of our history." End of quote. These key statements present a few of the basic features of the federal government's decentralized memorial concept and make clear that the main task is to preserve the historic sites throughout the country where people suffered and where crimes were committed both during the Nazi era and during the Second German dictatorship. Before I use my remaining time to address the more recent and current efforts made in Berlin to commemorate and reappraise the past, I'd like to give a brief summary. Commemoration of the Nazi rule of terror is defined by our knowledge that the Holocaust is beyond comparison. For this reason, Germany bears a particular responsibility for the victims of the National Socialist tyranny and for the consequences of the Second World War. Added to this is the task of reconciliation for the wrongs committed by the East German dictatorship. Thus, the federal government's objective is to accept responsibility, strengthen reconciliation with the past, and engage in commemoration. The commemoration activities must honor the victims at their authentic place of suffering in an appropriate manner and provide knowledge about the historical context. The memorial concept from 2008 notably fulfills these obligations of the commemoration policy. According to this concept, prominent institutions will receive funding when they are representative of a certain form of persecution. The new memorial concept will also reinforce reconciliation for the wrongs, as I said earlier, committed in the Soviet occupation zone and in former East Germany. Furthermore, memorials honoring Soviet soldiers and prisoners of war also receive funding. Currently, a total of 26 memorial sites honoring the victims of the Nazis receive funding from the federal government, including, for example, the early concentration camps known throughout Germany: Bergen-Belsen, Flossenbürg, Neuengamme, and Dachau, along with the memorial for the murdered Jews in the very center of Berlin. The recently opened memorials to the Sinti and Roma who were murdered by Nazis and the homosexuals persecuted under National Socialism, the two last also both in the very center of Berlin. All the more, the federal government is currently also involved in the construction of a memorial to the Nuremberg trials at the authentic historic site. Here is another example, the Jewish Museum, which is now approximately 10 to 11 years old, with the extension of the building, which you see on the right by the architect Daniel Liebeskind. I would like to sort of show you a few images of the so-called theme year that is taking place and going on in Berlin at the moment. This is a theme year carried out through the entire year, or well, better to be correct and precise, from January 30th to November 9th this year. And it's called Diversity Destroyed. This is the most acute campaign, as I said, and it's the two dates refer to the 80th anniversary of Hitler's accession to power, which took place on, as you will know, on January 30th, 1933, and the so-called Reichskristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, on November 9th. A variety of projects will deal with everyday life in Berlin and in this period during the Nazi dictatorship. It's a city-wide project, and I will show you some images. And of course, as you can see, over 500 events and exhibitions are taking place citywide this year. you have here a map of Berlin with the key places where something is going on. Here, for example, large-scale posters in the middle of the city where, in this case, for example, is explained you are not allowed to go to school anymore, referring to, of course, the Nuremberg laws and other restrictions. You see a central exhibition in the Deutsches Historisches Museum, in the German Historical Museum, in the very center of Berlin, where all different activities, all exhibitions are being explained and referred to. And here, for example, a recently taken photograph at the Brandenburg Gate. It couldn't get any more prominent. You have these columns in the center, always referring to the Germans and Jews, which contributed to the richness of the Weimar Republic and the life that was destroyed. Here, another example, unter den Linden at the Lustgarten, row of these columns with biographies. For example, the second here is Bert Brecht and many others. Yeah. This is what it looks like in Berlin. Wherever you go to, you will be seeing something like this, even in the suburbs, because there are exhibitions in the suburbs as well, pointing at local events taking place, or pointing at, for example, Jews who worked and lived there. Perhaps so much for what is going on in Berlin at the moment. I think you have got a picture of the general concept, and I would now like to switch to 1989. Not counting the Nuremberg trials that began in 1945 to prosecute war criminals, it took a good 20 years before a broad public supported confrontation with the Nazi crimes began in the Federal Republic of Germany. After the fall of the communist dictatorship in East Germany, the situation was completely different. To a certain degree, the examination of the past began only 1 month after the fall of the wall, when peaceful civil rights activists in East Germany stormed the headquarters of the Stasi in December 1989 and January 1990 and secured the secret police files that they found there. On October 3rd, 1990, the newly founded Stasi Records Agency, a federal office first headed by Joachim Gauck, today's German president, began its work, establishing a basis for scholarly research and for a responsible approach to dealing with files that often concerned private individuals. Swift action continued, as in May 1992, the first of the 2 enquete commissions appointed by the German Bundestag to reappraise the East German communist dictatorship began its work, and in very, very few years they produced an enormous amount of books and volumes, and you have some here from our library in our memorial. This led to several other initiatives and institutions. For example, the founding of the so-called Federal Foundation for the Reappraisal of the SED Dictatorship, Stiftung zur Aufarbeitung der SED-Diktatur, which began its work in the fall of 1998. This institution, the Stiftung as we only call it, the foundation, promotes a comprehensive reappraisal of the causes, history and impact of the dictatorship in the Soviet zone of occupation in East Germany and then the later so-called German Democratic Republic. The foundation also supports the reappraisal of communist dictatorships in international contexts, and it collaborates with a wide range of institutions and supports, as far as possible, projects with regard to both content and funding. But back to early 1990. Soon after the fall of the East German regime, a large amount of scholarly publications were published. You have seen some of them, mostly focusing on the former secret police known as the Stasi, and we are very often talking about the Stasi trap, the Stasi Falle, as far because the academics and researchers focused or concentrated on the Stasi only and did not look behind it, looked which party was responsible. But of course the Stasi was everywhere and most detested. There were also many regional efforts to come to terms with the past, but as for the actual war, the broad majority of the population was in agreement that the border fortifications, specifically in the wall that cut through the center of Berlin, should disappear as quickly as possible. And you see a wall packer working hard here. The general feeling across party lines was that the material or structural sources of the East German communist regime should disappear completely and within the shortest possible period of time. When you spoke to Berlin residents at the time, they all felt like released prisoners who wanted to discard their prison clothing, and this prison clothing was certainly the Berlin Wall. Exactly 200 years after the storming of the Bastille in Paris, where the Parisians had done the same, namely destroyed the hated prison that represented and symbolized the power of the monarchy, with the help of the border troops, the Bundeswehr, and heavy equipment from the British Army, Berliners destroyed that deeply despised structure, doing so at the behest of East Germany's first and only freely elected parliament. At the end of March 1990, the law to demolish the wall was passed, and the official demolition pressed ahead on June 13th, 1990. And here is a picture of the beginning of the official demolition of the wall in Bernauer Straße. At the very last minute, at the end of September, just shortly before German unification on October 3rd, the still existing East Berlin Institute for Heritage Conservation had 12 sections of the wall added to a list of landmarked structures in East Berlin. Then the wall was put aside, at least by the majority of the population. But just shortly after the peaceful revolution in 1889, several private individuals, initiative groups, or official agency had recognized that the history of German division, the 1 in 100 years event of the falling of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, should not be reduced to presentations in history books and photograph collections. They understood the importance of securing sites as material evidence. Thanks to their civic ideas, not only in Berlin, but also along the former inner German border, very different kinds of museums, memorials and monuments were established which address these recent events in German history. And I'm showing you here some of these border installations along the former inner German border. On the left-hand side, you see the so-called Point Alpha, which is an extreme situation. On the left-hand side, you see an American watchtower, the smaller one, and on the right-hand side, you see the East German watchtower, the wall in between, or a fence in that case only. They were constantly observing each other, a rather absurd situation. And the other one on the right-hand side is Mödlerreuth. Mödlerreuth, also known as Little Berlin, on the border of Bavaria and Thuringia, a little village of approximately 35 houses, 35 families, divided into two by the border because it was both in Bavaria and Thuringia, as it were, and then divided from 61 to even earlier, because the inner German border was already closed in 1952, but the measures were strengthened in 61. Yeah, so we have a lot of these smaller sites along the former inner German border. The inner German border used to be approximately 1,400 kilometers, so 900 miles or something long, and there are quite a number of these sites, and some of them were honored in 2011 with the newly introduced European Cultural Heritage seal. And two more here, Eichsfeld on the left-hand side and the former checkpoint on the motorway on the Autobahn on the motorway to Berlin between Hanover and Berlin. So this is also now a European heritage site. Leipzig, the Ring of Leipzig, where the peaceful demonstrations took place in autumn 1989. On the left-hand side, you see the museum and the headquarters of the former of the Stasi, the so-called Runde Ecke, which is now also a museum, and two more. The institution for which I'm responsible, we are also on the European Heritage list. As I said earlier, in Berlin, the years 1990 to 2005 represent the period in which forgetting about the war was carried out to its greatest possible extent. And yet, in 91, the 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall led the Berlin Senate to pass a resolution calling for a memorial site in remembrance of the Berlin Wall to be erected on Bernauer Straße, despite the fact that most of the wall had already been torn down there. So, why Bernauer Straße? And I'm going to show you some historic photographs of Bernauer Straße because it's so iconic and so prominent. I'm sure you will know some of these pictures. Here is the border through the center of Berlin. Why is it not a straight line? It's not a straight line because the division of Berlin was decided during the conferences of Tehran and Yalta in 1943 and 44, and then finally fixed at the Potsdam Conference in 45. They didn't, while sitting in Tehran and Yalta, they had a district map of Berlin right in front of them, and that was a district map from 1920. They didn't care about existing borderlines of districts, for example, between the district of Mitte, Tiergarten, Wedding, whatsoever. It was a district lines, just as it divided the city into several districts. And Bernauer Straße, and this is the most famous and iconic street, is, just on this straight, almost straight line, just north of the center where you have the east written down, and then there is this line just up there. This is Bernauer Straße. Bernauer Straße is famous because it was chosen to have this central memorial because of the street's unusual situation when Berlin was divided. The south side of the street belonged to the Soviet sector, while the north side was situated in the French sector. So what did that look like? This is a picture from Bernauer Straße from 1960. You can see on the right-hand side a sign saying Fin du secteur français. And that means end of the French sector. The walkway is still West Berlin. The houses you see are already in the east. So that was decided, as I said, in 1945, or fixed at the Potsdam Conference. Didn't matter really until the wall went up on August 13th, 1961. People, I mean, it still looks like just right after the war, but you can see those two people on the left-hand side. They are still in East Berlin. Those children are still in East Berlin. This girl on the right-hand side is already in West Berlin. This didn't matter. There were approximately 60,000 commuters every day. They were commuting between East and West. They, for example, lived in West Berlin, worked in East Berlin, or vice versa. And that was the street. This was just the extreme. This is August 61. On the right-hand side, you can see the barbed wire, or I hope you can see it. I know that it is there. You can see the barbed wire lying over the street, and here on the left-hand side, again, explained the border situation, what it was like. This is in September and October 61. You can taken, of course, from the west, this picture. You are on the western side. The streets are already empty, and the houses are empty, and the houses are bricked off. 2,500 people had to leave their homes. They were thrown out of their homes overnight. You can see the barbed wire has disappeared, and you can see a wall over the street on the right-hand side, and you can see some obstacles and fences and on the top of the roofs. Yeah, just another picture showing the wall across one of the streets. You can see, this is also Bernauer Straße, you can see people in the west waving to their families and friends in the east, which was officially forbidden. And in the very last second, people, this is September 61, people escaping from those houses in the Soviet sector. And for example, here on the left-hand side, there is an old lady trying to jump out of the window. The Stasi is trying to hold her back on the west, on the western walkway. You have the police department and fire department with a safe net and catching Oma Schulze, and she finally makes it. And on the right-hand side, we see the family that has just decided to leave. This is Bernauer Straße as well. This is August 15th. This is Konrad Schumann, an East German soldier who had just decided to escape over the barbed wire. This is, so as I said, Bernauer Straße. Pictures of successful escapes. And then there were tunnels, and these tunnels were relatively famous. We had 11 tunnels in Bernauer Straße. 2 were successful in 1962 and 64. In this one, the pictures are from 64, showing the so-called Tunnel 57, because 57 people managed to disappear into the west. Bernauer Straße was famous for the memorials. In that street, 5 people alone died, and international visitors such as Robert Kennedy, for example, Martin Luther King, they were brought to Bernauer Straße to see this, and they were also laying down wreaths. This is this is 1965. The houses are now being demolished, but they left the ground floors standing, because if you've got a wall, you can use it. And this was 1972, and it looked like 1980, like this. It was only up from 1980 onwards that this last wall was, that everyone knows, this L-shaped elements were introduced. Yeah, here another picture of Bernauer Straße, an iconic view from the west into the east. You can see the Church of Reconciliation here, standing in the middle of nowhere, standing in the death strip between east and west. You can see the houses have disappeared. You can only see sort of remains of the ground floors still standing. And here is an aerial view with the same situation. And as late as 1985, they blew up the church. Because it was, of course, difficult to control this area. All these events led the state and federal governments to agree to develop Bernauer Straße into a central site to commemorate the Berlin Wall. But another 7 contentious years would pass before the so-called monument could be finally opened in 1998 by a young lady called Angela Merkel. At the time, she was still a young government minister. Yeah, this is sorry. This is now the same view without the church. And here is what Angela Merkel opened in 1998. So this is the only surviving bit in Berlin where you still have the entire width of the former Death Strip framed by iron walls at the side, and this was the result of an international competition in between 95 and 98. The rescuing and safeguarding of war remnants at the time was also in the hands of civic commitment. In the very center was Father Fischer, the local vicar in Bernauer Straße on the west side, who had lost his church that he had never entered, and that stood in the middle of the death strip that I had shown to you. So this experience of losing a church was partly his main reason that he, when the demolition of the wall began in June 1990, that he was the one who literally stood in front of the caterpillars and said, you can destroy the wall wherever you want, but not here. We will need it for future generations. We will need this sort of physical evidence. Well, at this point, and this is 1998, scholars also began taking an interest in the structural remains of the wall. In 1998, for the first time since the fall of the wall, a scholarly examination of how to deal with the remains of the wall was published by our British colleague Lady Polly Feversham and my former boss, Professor Leo Schmidt, both archaeologists and art historians, and the book title was called The Berlin Wall Today. However, in many places, memorials commemorating victims of the wall and authentic historic sites where the communist rule of injustice operated were often still in the hands of private citizens. Politicians were very slow to approach this difficult and uncomfortable history and physical heritage that continues to be volatile even today. One could summarize that in the 90s, official political efforts in Berlin to give the memory of the wall a home seemed half-hearted. One reason was no doubt that the memories of the divided city were very different on the west and east sides. Another 6 years passed before a private provocation made the public and Berlin politicians aware of what was missing. Although the Berlin Wall Memorial on Bernauer Straße that was opened by Merkel in 1998 is dedicated explicitly to the victims of communist tyranny, the claim was made that there was no longer a site in Berlin recalling the city's painful division. In spring 2004, on a leased property on Friedrichstraße, and that is what you see here, right in the middle of former Checkpoint Charlie, the privately run museum house at Checkpoint Charlie set up its own private monument for the people who died at the war and the inner German border. The installation consisted of a 144-meter long replica of the wall, as you can see on the side, and on the left-hand side. But Frau Hildebrand, who is the owner of the museum, didn't care about any historic accuracy. For example, the wall fits in this gap, but the real site of the wall was here. So, so not only 144 meters long, and there were 1,065 wooden crosses, each one representing a person identified by name who had died either at the inner German border or at the border in Berlin. Although, as I would call it, this art event was not concerned with historical accuracy, the provocative act was effective, and the Berlin Parliament was under enormous political pressure. Within a year, the federal government and the state of Berlin presented a general concept for the commemoration of German division that surprisingly was promoted by the left-winger Thomas Flierl, Berlin Minister for Culture and Science. It was presented to the public in the spring of 2005, and you see the concept here. It's a decentral, and you can I'm showing you this map with how the wall went through the city and this decentralized. This concept included 15 different wall sites that were linked, but with each one representing a different commemorative focus. The choice of sites was based on a precise inventory of the structural remains of the wall that had been carried out between 2003, a project in which I was allowed to play a leading role. The concept, for which a total of 37 million euros were made available from the state of Berlin, the federal government and the European Union, followed the basic idea that through dignified commemoration, the victims' dignity would be returned to them, and that the wall should not only serve a national monument for the German people, but also as an international symbol of the Cold War. The ambivalence between the national and international claim was to be accommodated by the centerpiece of this decentralized concept, namely the memorial in Bernauer Straße, which was to equally address the local, national and international dimensions of the wall. This concept that was developed in such a short time also included the establishment of the Berlin Wall Foundation, which consisted of two institutions at different locations, the Berlin Wall Memorial in Bernauer Straße and the Marienfelde Refugee Museum, Center Museum that presents a detailed history of German division. Marienfelde is the place where approximately 1.4 million people who left East Germany passed through the West German emergency reception procedure. The foundation began its work in January 2009 and since then has made considerable progress towards achieving its central goal, the expansion of the memorial in Bernauer Straße. The central design criteria of this memorial are, and I'm showing you here another more detailed map of the entire street. So these 37 million euros we got are there to first of all buy land, to own the property, because we had to deal with approximately 100 different landowners in this former death strip, which you can see along the side, and the idea is to develop this exhibition in the former death strip, and the entire street is 1.4 kilometers long. First of all, along Bernauer Straße, the space of the former death strip will be revisualized, but it is not to be reconstructed. Structures of weathering steel have been added to many areas where the wall was not preserved, allowing us to reinforce the authenticity of the memorial site as historical truth without creating reconstructions. The guideline calling for no reconstructions assures that visitors do not experience a breach of trust, questioning the authenticity of the site. Where any material evidence found to be fake, it would destroy the credibility of the complex as a whole and place doubt on the truth of the history it tells. That's a few examples, so you can see in the rather in the middle, you can see the authentic wall, the real stuffs that survived, and you can see these additions to the left and right. Here, of course, is a longer bit of the authentic so-called border wall, and here is the reshaping, or revisualizing with an iron curtain. It was an international architects competition that was decided in 2007, and you see here this curtain showing where the wall once was, and you can clearly identify between old and new. Here, along the former patrol strip, in the former death strip, we have these so-called information islands with multimedia in it, and to inform people, we do have, and our visitors, we do have audio and video material, we have photographs, and the entire information we give, and that is important to mention, it is a multi-perspective approach. And we deliberately do include quotes and original speeches of, for example, former East German SED leaders or border troop officers, since we believe in our visitors' ability to judge. So here, for example, a column in the street dedicated to one victim of the war, somebody who died there, who was killed while escaping. This is what we call an archaeological window, something original traces of historic structures that were destroyed by the war, in this case remnants of a street. An aerial view here with, again, on the left-hand side, you can see the wall and the sort of retracing of it. This is here the border wall. On the right-hand side here, you can see the so-called hinterland wall, which was the most eastern authentic elements of the light strip. The retracing of a watchtower, of course, explained what it is. Here is the retracing of the church, of the foundations of the church that we unearthed in 2010 and 11, and trying to make clear the dimension of the former church. We're working with large-scale photographs alongside the street. Here, Konrad Schumann escaping over the barbed wire, very close to the site where he actually escaped. And, of course, pieces of the hinterland wall with modern graffiti on it. And finally, the Window of Remembrance. The authentic structural remains of the border fortifications stand as the focus of the presentation. So the real surviving stuff is vital for us. It's in the center of the entire story, since they most vividly convey the violent nature of the communist regime that used them as a security instrument to legitimize its undemocratic rule. The violent nature of the system is also most visible in the sites where people were killed while trying to escape to West Berlin, or who died later as a consequence of the violence against them. One of the central tasks of the memorial is to identify these people by name and to present their faces and their biographies, and that's what I'm showing you here, to the extent that they are known to the public, so that they are anchored in the public memory. In addition to this memorial, we have a service every day at 12 o'clock, every day at noon, a service dedicated to one of the victims. So everyone can attend, and everybody can also read the service. It's only like 12 or 15 minutes, and we have one biography every day, since we believe that as long as we are saying the names, the people behind the names will not be forgotten. As an authentic site where historic events took place, and as a site to commemorate the victims, the memorial is both a place of individual mourning and a place for the collective commemoration of all victims of communist tyranny. On an additional level, the memorial plays a role in making the public aware that the danger exists when democratic structures and human rights are all challenged. However, we haven't finished yet, but the concept seems to be successful. Last year, approximately 700,000 people visited the memorial. The site is perceived not only as a place to address the unfathomable suffering and fate of individuals, but also as a site and hope, since it also shows that under certain political circumstances, it is possible to overcome a dictatorial system. So some photos of the opening on the 50th anniversary of building the wall. You can see some familiar faces on the picture up there. People from all over the world come to our memorial to see and enter the site of the man-made miracle, the peaceful revolution that took place without a single shot being fired. Here, and this is an indicator that this site is accepted now, whether a rather, I don't know, interesting one, that we are now on the so-called Berlin City Tour. So the tourist buses come and this site is accepted, but not only tourist buses, but also, as you can see here, another picture from the opening. It was crowded with people. When we opened, we had more than 30,000 visitors on that day. Only an estimated figure, but relatively reliable. And some more well-known figures come. As you can see here, Victoria of Sweden, the Crown Princess, and on the right-hand side, Prince Harry of England. So it's an accepted site. People come and visit, and both the federal government as well as the Berlin Senate on a regular basis send us VIP visitors to see it. And what a story to be told. Not a single shot being fired, no blood shed, and the dictatorship was yet peacefully overcome. We were prepared for everything, later said Horst Sindermann, member of the Politburo, but we were not prepared for candles and prayers. One has only to think today of the reports of disaster coming from Syria, where people are currently fighting a dictatorship and where more than 70,000 people have died since the fighting and the struggle for freedom began. Just as John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King and Ronald Reagan in the past came to see the wall and the tyranny it represented, people today come to see the remains of the wall, to see and to learn that freedom and democracy are not something to be taken for granted. They also learn that commemoration need authentic sites for understanding, and that is something we who are dealing with the second dictatorship have clearly learned from our colleagues who have established this wide field of coming to terms with the difficult past of the NS tyranny. However, and I would like to end with this, it is our wonderful duty, our task and everyday challenge to spread this key message. Freedom and democracy cannot be taken for granted. In less than a month from now, on June 26, it is 50 years ago that President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin and gave one of his most famous speeches in which he encouraged the free world to defend freedom and peace in West Berlin and Central Europe. It was the people's longing for freedom that in 1989 encouraged the courageous men and women of East Germany to protest peacefully against the second German dictatorship. And I'm convinced that President Kennedy would have strongly supported the peaceful demonstrators in Leipzig, in Plauen, in Berlin, and elsewhere. It is our duty, and I'm strongly believe in that, it is our duty to keep this peaceful struggle for human rights alive wherever we may be. Thank you so much for your patience and attention. There are questions.
Yes, here. Germany certainly led the way in teaching the world about commemoration and confronting the past. And I'm sure Germany had a positive influence, for example, on President Mitterrand in his acceptance in speaking about the Velodrome d'Hiver and that commemoration, and certainly now in Warsaw, with the opening of the Holocaust Museum there. I'm wondering if more can be done with other countries in the EU who are not quite there yet, who haven't looked to the past, certainly not for the victims but for themselves, not to repress. And I'm very struck by this new, I don't know if this is new, this idea of the decentralization and having it around the city. I think it's amazing. And can that be deployed, for example, in Austria or even in Poland?
Yeah, this is something which I'm very grateful for this question, because it's something that is always or has been connected with Germany during the last 10, 20 years perhaps. And it's, of course, as I said, it's first of all our task to do this with a history, and Consul Schütte has mentioned it, with a history like that. You have to do it. You have to deal with it. And but of course, other countries, especially in Eastern Europe, let's have a look, or let's say Hungary, let's say Czech Republic, Slovakia, and all these. They are trying to work hard, but they haven't got the funding. And I was in Hungary about a month ago in Budapest, and it was very telling that at this actually great conference there were only, first of all, very few Hungarian colleagues and only a little public interest. But still, I mean, we do, I wouldn't say that we should, how to say that, that the German discourse should dominate it. But I think it's certainly something that as long as we exchange our knowledge with our colleagues in many different countries, it could also be in, for example, and if you look at this memorial there to the right, you could see something very, very similar, for example, in Argentina, where people disappeared under the dictatorship. The language of commemoration is very similar there. You have similar installations, for example, in some places in Spain with the dictatorship there. But it's extremely hard for those nations to come to terms with their past. It's difficult. In Hungary, for example, they not only they had something comparable to the NSDAP, the Nazi party as well. The so-called, I only know the German term, the Pfeilkreuzler. This was a party which was very, very close and which was supported by the German Nazi party. They have this heritage, and immediately after that they have the communist heritage. And to bring that together, who is a victim, who is a perpetrator, it goes through all the families. And this is something very, very sensitive to have in mind while dealing with it.
That's a segue to what I've been wanting to formulate. Thank you, first of all. It's a very informative and helpful to be updated about what's being done. I'm wondering whether, given this decentralized concept and the clear need for people to interact with these sites, whether your plans include events for storytelling by people as this theme cuts through, as you just said. I mean, when you look at the Holocaust Museum in South Africa, or in any place where memory is a live thing that includes the pain of the present, it seems to me that what your interest has been is presenting information and letting people stand with that or sit with it. My question is, how are you proposing to deal with all of the different narratives that people bring with them, whether they're visitors whose forebears, were part of this, or whether they're people who have stuffed their pain and, just want to, stand there and be there, but the 40 years that it may take for these stories to come out these places might really be helpful in helping that kind of conversation to take place. I think of this partly because in 2009, for example, I was in Leipzig, just interested in what was being said and done about the 20th anniversary. By the way, I don't use the term the fall of the wall. I don't think the wall fell. But it was the Fall der Mauer. And I went to an occasion, I'll be very brief because I know there's lots more to be said, but a dialogue was being held among the different parties to the opposition parties. And I had the feeling, having been in the GDR many, many times during the 60s, 70s, 80s, that the people speaking there had never had the chance to speak with each other since the 80s, since 89, 90. There was so much animosity, there was so much passion, and it was a very good event, but I felt as if they needed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because they were speaking for the first time in 20 years. I mean, that's not true. I know that all kinds of work has been done, but that was the sense I got. So, hence, there's a need for storytelling. Are you planning that?
We are doing it. What I did was, of course, present to you only the visible. But we have in our political education department very many different formats for different target groups. So, for example, what we introduced 1.5 years ago was the so-called Zeitzeugenbüro or Café. And this is the contemporary witnesses. We invite them to talk. We invite them to, this is on a Sunday afternoon with a little bit of apple cake and a tea, and they are telling their stories. It's a completely different format, and all of a sudden you get people you wouldn't get anywhere else. So they talk together. We have another, and telling their stories. We, of course, record their stories. We use them for the information columns. We use them for publications, for exhibitions, if they allow this. And but also we cooperate with many different institutions. For example, one that is just doing a program under the wonderful name said "Frag mal Oma." And this means this is for children, and these children ask their grandmothers and grandfathers to tell their story. What was it like living in the GDR? What was it like in in Berlin? What was it like in West Berlin? How did you sort of live with the war? Was it usual? Was it different? So with all these different formats, we try to bring. It's like a jigsaw. And of course this is, and what I have shown to you is one thing, but what we are trying to bring together is that we have different views, but of course and that is our task, and that's what we, at the end of the day, get our money from the federal government and from the Berlin Senate, is that we are giving or perpetuating this key message. We are talking about the values of democracy and freedom, and this is something one can learn there. So, we are trying to involve young people as much as possible. We are, for example, on August 13th, we are doing something. We have round tables with people who were involved in the peaceful revolution. And young students or pupils of 15, 16, 17 sit together with the revolutionaries. And they are exchanging their question and answers. How was it? Why did you do it? And sometimes just ordinary stories like, I wanted to see my grandpa again. Or, of course we wanted freedom. We wanted free elections. We wanted to travel and so forth. And then there is a dialogue. And this is what I think also on our site in the former death strip is the most important thing, and that is these are, for me, the fruitful moments when I see families coming, for example, 3 generations talking to each other, children asking questions, And they have, for example, a mobile phone with them, so they can use an app. Grandpa can't use an app, but he knows the story. So, and then they are working together, and that's wonderful. And so this is how it works. And I have the feeling that, of course, we also do a lot of evening events, showing movies, showing or have discussions, lectures on all aspects of both East and West. Because what we learn there is that everyday life was, of course, what I recently heard was that even in the dictatorship, the sun was shining. You know, there was an everyday life. People were sort of getting used to certain things, but, for example, never accepted certain restrictions. And that is what we try to bring together, trying to find out and trying to also, of course, to document and preserve these stories for future generations. And that is, again, another lesson we have learned from our colleagues who are dealing with the Nazi past. Their contemporary witnesses cannot be, or can hardly be asked and questioned anymore, because they are simply not there anymore.
I really want to...
There is a... Sorry. Yeah, you'll be the next.
I enjoyed your presentation. I had a question. In your opinion, is the fact that both the Chancellor and the President of Germany are from the East have an influence one way or the other on this heightened awareness of the GDR time, or would it have happened anyways? Do you have a feel for that? Especially because I understand the President in his own past had a very persecuted family situation. I can't remember if it was during the National Socialist era or the GDR, or perhaps both. But what influence do you think the fact that they both come from the East has on the awareness?
The percentage of sort of high level ministries and responsibilities for people from the East is relatively high, given that it was, in comparison, such a small state. But well, to answer your question, I think it's what we have is it all started earlier. It started immediately, as I tried to explain, when the wall came down. I would say came down, not fell. And in that respect, today they are both, of course, both President Gauck as well as Chancellor Merkel. They are promoting our activities and fostering our activities, and they. But I think it is a general concern, has been a general concern for many, many years now, beginning with the reappraisal of the Nazi past. And this has been going on, at least in West Germany, for many, many years. In East Germany, it wasn't a topic, really. It was done because it was an anti-fascist state by definition. That's what they wrote down in their laws and everything. We are an anti-fascist state, and this, funny or not, that is why the Berlin Wall was called an anti-fascist protection rampart. That was the official title in the GDR for it. And so, in that respect, I think, yes, they support us, but others would have done the same. But it's a topic currently for Merkel, is very much in the press again because of her past in the GDR. It's a constant topic, but it's election time. There's this lady here. I'm sorry, this microphone was passed to her. Yeah.
May I ask you, is Mikhail Gorbachev, whom we have to thank most for the coming down of the wall, anywhere celebrated among these wall memorials?
He's a key figure in the game, as many others as well, and had he not been there, the world would have been different. But I believe that, the stars were just right at the time. Many things came together, but the most respect, I think, has to be paid to the peaceful demonstrators in the streets. They were so courageous, because if you have the year of '89 in your mind, it was in the summer. There was this terrible massacre in Beijing. It was only June. It was the same year. And one of the East German ministers, and then Egon Krenz, who was the successor of Erich Honecker, he was at this last demonstration in Leipzig, October 9th. They were still debating about whether they should use, as they called it, or whether they carry out the so-called Chinese solution, and that was the massacre in Beijing. So, yes, without Gorbachev, it wouldn't have been there, but there was also Bush. There was Helmut Kohl, and there were many others who played a vital part, but and it was certainly the friendship between Gorbachev and Bush that it all worked. Margaret Thatcher was not too helpful, I must say. But in the overall picture, it was because so many pieces came together. Yes?
I was in Germany November 9th during Kristallnacht, and I really wanted to thank you for your lecture, because it's the first time that I hear this from a German perspective, the commemoration and things that are being done now. So it's, for me, a wonderful thing to have heard you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming, because I believe it is a very painful topic, and so I'm even more grateful that you are here.
Yes, so this past summer I was in Schöneberg at the Rathaus, but also in the Bavarian quarter, so two different, both dictatorships affected there. And the Wir sind Nachbarn exhibit in the Rathaus is very moving to me, because that's where my family is from. And I had the experience of being there when a student group from Berlin visited the exhibition, and many of the students were from a migration background. And I was wondering, there was some grumbling about being there. I'm not sure that that's entirely unique given it's 15-year-olds, but how do you make monuments to these two dictatorships relevant to people who are not ethnic Germans, who are going to visit them as part of civic education if they come from other countries and maybe have different backgrounds?
Again, I think that's a matter of different formats. I can say that for the dealing with the Nazi past, that of course in particularly, and I had visited the former concentration camp of now memorial site of Flossenbürg only recently. And Flossenbürg is, one must say, in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in northern Bavaria. It's far away from everything. And they have a wonderful exhibition there. They are looking at the different groups of victims, whether they are, for example, from Hungary, from Bulgaria, from Belarus, wherever they came from. And they have a little exhibition personalized, always on some representative victims. So people come there from these countries and immediately identify with somebody from Poland, for example, or Russia, or wherever. So again, looking at target groups, and we are now of course, in a time where young people, let's say they are even 20, they have no personal memory of the division. They don't know a thing. They don't know who Adenauer was, they don't know who Ulbricht or Honecker or whatever. Yeah, this is sad, but this is not really relevant. I think the values of freedom, democracy, dictatorship are the ones we are talking about. And this is, for example, talking to young Germans with a Turkish migrant background. And this is a big topic in Berlin, of course. We have to think of, and that's what we are doing, we are thinking of new ways to approach them. First, I mentioned this new media, which is not so new anymore. Of course, this is one thing, but also we try to bring it, to link it with their, perhaps, family histories. Because they have lived, or their parents came from Anatolia to West Berlin, and they have their story. But this is still a long way to go. And this has been sort of this problem, and this challenge has been recognized, and we are working on it to develop new formats.
Two quick factual questions. Is there, for the first dictatorship, is there any marker at or near the spot where Hitler committed suicide? And secondly, in the communist dictatorship, one of the things that happens when there isn't sufficient capital in an economy is buildings deteriorate rapidly. And I wondered if any of the dilapidated buildings have been preserved to show people what it was like, or are they all torn down?
The first question, no, there is not. On the site where Hitler committed suicide today, luckily, is the memorial to the murdered Jews. It's just, I mean, there are people that know exactly where he committed suicide, but that doesn't play a role. It's the memorial to the murdered Jews is on the site of the former Reichskanzlei, the Reichschancellery, and partly it's also Goebbels' bunker. So when they started to build it, they found Goebbels' bunker, they found remains and bunkers of the Reichskanzlei because they couldn't be blown up. The Russians were not able to blow these structures up because they were up to 12 meters of concrete bunkers. So there is no indication where he died, and I think it's not necessary because the story is being told elsewhere. The other thing is, yes, you are pointing at the conservation of... could you please repeat which building you're talking about exactly? Is it...
I just wondered if there were any deteriorated buildings that are preserved as an example of what happened under that system of economy.
Oh yes, of course. I mean, I did not mention, for example, the Stasi prison at Hohenschönhausen. So these memorial sites, there are other prisons in Bautzen, for example, in Halle, in Magdeburg, and many other prisons where political prisoners were, thank you, were kept. But then there are very many administrative buildings in the center of Berlin where for example, SED party resided and where they have their official offices. They are being reused for other things and other purposes.
Sir, after World War II, many leaders of the Nazi regime were held accountable, and indeed some of them were tried as war criminals. To what extent were key figures in the communist leadership of East Germany held accountable after the fall of the Iron Curtain?
Yeah, thank you. This is a long topic and a difficult question because it also, we had the first trials were actually not against the leaders. Honecker had disappeared, for example, to South America. But in 92 and 93 there were those trials against those who killed people at the border, so fairly low-rank officers or even simple soldiers only. So these were carried out, and there are 2 or 3 or 4 of the former Politburo high-rank officers in the rank of ministers. They were sent to prison for 1 or 2 years for crimes against humanity. For example, those for killing people at the border or being responsible for killing people at the border. But the overall idea was that this was a juristical problem of the GDR, and that state did not exist anymore. In a way, something very similar to what happened 50 or 40 years earlier with the Nazi crimes, because this was, and I quote the former minister or president of the federal state of Baden-Württemberg, Filbinger. He was held responsible for his actions during the Third Reich, and he sort of was trying to protect him and defend himself by saying what was correct and lawful in the old system cannot be wrong today. So this was thoughts were transferred, and there is I cannot say the correct term for it, but when the GDR ended and when unification started on October 3rd, there was also a line in one of the laws that was saying that they cannot held guilty for everything, and but some of the main responsible figures were indeed, but as many people say, not of course too few.
Yes, thank you very much for an extremely interesting commentary. I'm just wondering how the idea to create these memorial sites was originally formulated. You mentioned that it was the students of the student movement in the 60s who really led the efforts to begin the Holocaust commemorative sites. Now, which groups were engaged in the commemorative sites to deal with this, with the Mauer? Was it Westerners? Was it Easterners? Was it political elites from the parties? Was it grassroots? Was it high school history teachers? Who put this into motion and really carried it, or conversely, did everybody get on board very quickly?
I think we should, to give a full answer, we have to consider each memorial. And but for example, if you have a look at the former prisons, those very often were former prisoners who were imprisoned in those prisons. They stood in front of them and said, we have to protect and maintain them for the future. This was in Hohenschönhausen the case, this was in Bautzen the case, in Halle as well, there's Ochse, and as well as with some of those Stasi headquarters in the different districts. These were usually political people from the opposition leaders, and who also got support from human rights activists, for example. In the case of Bernauer Straße, this was clearly a Western exercise. On the eastern side, people said, we don't need it, we want to get rid of it as quickly as possible, we don't want to see it anymore. Then I mentioned those 12 sites that were put under conservation law. They had a certain, in 1990, there was a certain secure status for them by law. And this, everything that was put under, was listed as a listed monument. This was protected in United Germany automatically. But still, I mean, on the inner German border, you have, like in Mödlerreuth, that I showed, you have people from both East and West. Sometimes very, I apologize, but very simple persons. They rescued a watchtower and did their little exhibition there. Both sometimes people who actually served there from the East, and sometimes for people from the West who had from the West Grenzpolizei, because there was of course a border police on the West as well, in the West as well. So civil commitment.
Well, I think that we should all thank Klausmeier. But he won't run away right away. We have a little reception in the background with some German wine, and I think if you let him drink a little bit in between, I think he's ready to answer more of your questions, and I thank you for coming tonight. And the full room shows that this was a subject that is of interest to many.
Thank you very much.